December 1940. London is a city of ghosts and sirens. The air, thick with the metallic tang of cordite and the chalky dust of pulverized brick, is punctuated by the percussive crump of falling bombs and the shriek of air raid warnings. In the makeshift hospitals set up in underground tube stations and school basements, surgeons work by flickering gaslight, their floors slick with blood. The primary killer isn't always the initial blast, but the shock that follows, the catastrophic loss of blood pressure from severe injury. The demand for blood transfusions is overwhelming, but the logistics are a nightmare. Whole blood is a fragile, fleeting resource. It requires careful blood typing to prevent fatal reactions, must be kept refrigerated, and spoils in about a week. For a city under constant siege, it's an impossible supply chain. Thousands are dying not for a lack of courage or medical skill, but for a lack of a stable, transportable, universal solution. Across the Atlantic, in the quiet, sterile hum of the Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, one man is on the verge of providing that solution. Dr. Charles Richard Drew, a brilliant and meticulously organized African-American surgeon, is perfecting a method that will change the face of wartime medicine forever. His work, funded by a coalition of British and American medical groups in a project that would become known as Blood for Britain, was not just an academic exercise. It was a race against the daily casualty reports coming out of Europe. Drew's genius was in recognizing the true life-saving component in the blood, the plasma. This straw-colored liquid, which makes up about 55% of blood's volume, is rich in proteins, clotting factors, and antibodies, but critically, it contains no red blood cells. It was the red blood cells with their A, B, and O antigens that made blood typing essential. Plasma, once separated, could be given to any patient, regardless of their blood type. It was a universal elixir for shock. The concept wasn't entirely new, but no one had ever figured out how to process, store, and transport it on an industrial scale. This is where Drew's methodical brilliance shone. He developed a rigorous protocol, a symphony of logistics and sterile procedure. He established a network of donor centers, designed mobile collection units that were the precursors to modern blood mobiles, and implemented a system of meticulous testing. His team would draw the whole blood, spin it in a centrifuge to separate the heavier red cells from the lighter plasma, and then pool the plasma from multiple donors, further diluting any remaining antigens to ensure its safety. The real breakthrough, however, was in preservation. Drew discovered that plasma, unlike whole blood, was remarkably stable. It could be stored for months under refrigeration. Even more revolutionary, it could be dehydrated, turned into a dry powder in a sealed can. To use it, a medic on a battlefield or in a bombed-out London hospital simply had to add sterilized water, shake it, and administer it. His radical method for separating and storing blood plasma transformed a logistical impossibility into a life-saving reality. He wasn't just a scientist, he was a systems architect. He designed the entire process, from the needle in the donor's arm to the intravenous drip in the wounded soldiers. He created the very concept of the large-scale centralized blood bank. The success of the Blood for Britain project was staggering. Thousands of units of plasma were shipped overseas, arriving safely and ready for use, pulling countless soldiers and civilians back from the brink of death. His work was hailed as a miracle of modern medicine. In 1941, in recognition of his unparalleled achievement, Drew was appointed the medical director of the very first American Red Cross blood bank, tasked with creating a national system to supply the U.S. military as it prepared for war. It was a triumph of science, a testament to a mind that saw a solution where others saw only an insurmountable problem. He had created a system that treated all blood as a universal human resource, a gift of life from one person to another, stripped of all biological markers of individual identity. Yet, as his genius brought this unifying hope to a world fractured by war, the very system he had built, within the very society he served, was about to impose its own brutal, unscientific, and deeply prejudiced identity upon the blood itself. Who decides whose blood is worth saving? Following that unprecedented success, the answer to that question arrived with the cold, bureaucratic certainty of a government directive. The shadow of systemic racism, a force as pervasive and destructive as any enemy bomber, fell hard upon the clean, sterile world of the blood bank. By early 1942, the American Red Cross, acting on a mandate from the U.S. War Department, implemented a policy that was a direct repudiation of the scientific principles upon which Drew's entire system was founded. It was decreed that the blood collected for the war effort would be segregated by the race of the donor. Initially, the policy was a logistical absurdity. Blood from black donors was to be accepted but stored separately from blood from white donors. Then, in a move that amplified the insult into a profound scientific and moral betrayal, the policy was clarified. Blood from black donors would not be administered to white soldiers. The very idea was anathema to Dr. Drew. It was a grotesque stain on the purity of his work. Science had proven unequivocally that the chemical and biological composition of blood plasma was identical regardless of the donor's skin color. The proteins, the antibodies, the life-sustaining fluid, they were universally human. To suggest otherwise was not just prejudice, it was a lie. Dr. Drew, the architect of the entire national blood program, was now in the untenable position of overseeing a system that enshrined a racist ideology he knew to be a dangerous fiction. He did not remain silent. His letters and public statements from this period, preserved today in archives at Howard University and the National Library of Medicine, are masterclasses in scientific clarity and moral courage. He wrote to the directors of the Red Cross and military officials, not with emotional appeals, but with the unassailable logic of a scientist. The blood of a Negro is the same as that of a white person, he argued, a statement that should have been self-evident but had to be defended against the tide of institutional bigotry. He pointed out the dangerous inefficiencies of the policy, the need for duplicate storage facilities, the complex and entirely unnecessary labeling systems, and the risk of a soldier dying for want of plasma when a perfectly good unit sat unused simply because of the donor's race. He called the policy a stupid blunder. He declared publicly that the blood of individual human beings may differ, but there is absolutely no scientific basis to indicate any difference in blood according to race. His protests were met with deaf ears. The policy was not rooted in science. It was rooted in the social and political reality of Jim Crow America. The military was segregated. The nation was segregated. The War Department feared that white soldiers would refuse transfusions if they knew the blood came from a black donor, a fear born of the same racist pseudoscience that propped up the entire edifice of segregation. The Red Cross, a civilian organization, capitulated to the military's demand. For Drew, this was more than a professional disagreement. It was a fundamental violation of his principles as both a doctor and a human being. He had dedicated his life to a field where the only things that mattered were cellular structures and biological functions. He had created a system to save lives, and now that system was being twisted to serve a hateful ideology that costs lives. In 1942, after less than a year as director, he made his choice. He resigned from the American Red Cross blood program. It was not a surrender. It was a protest, a silent scream against the institutionalized prejudice that had contaminated his life's work. He refused to attach his name to a program that valued racial purity over human life. He walked away from the national platform, returning to his roles as a professor and chief surgeon at Howard University, where he would dedicate himself to training the next generation of black surgeons, building an institution of excellence in the face of a world that sought to deny it. How could the nation embrace his life-saving invention but reject the very humanity of its creator? Building on that egregious injustice, the cruelest twist of fate lay ahead, a final, tragic chapter that would become a powerful and painful parable for the very system Dr. Drew fought against. On the morning of April 1, 1950, Dr. Drew was driving through rural North Carolina with 3 of his colleagues. They were heading to a medical conference in Tuskegee, Alabama, an annual event for Black physicians who were barred from the major medical associations. Drew had been up late the night before, performing a long and difficult surgery. He was exhausted. Near Burlington, North Carolina, he likely fell asleep at the wheel. The car veered off the road, rolled over multiple times, and ejected him. His injuries were catastrophic, particularly to his leg, which was pinned beneath the vehicle, and he suffered massive internal bleeding. The other doctors, though injured themselves, managed to free him and recognize the severity of his condition. An ambulance arrived and rushed him to the nearest hospital, Alameint's General Hospital. It was here that the story of Charles Drew crystallized into a potent, heartbreaking myth. For decades, the story was told and retold that the great Dr. Charles Drew, the father of the blood bank, bled to death because this whites-only hospital refused to give him a blood transfusion. It was a story so perfectly, tragically ironic that it felt like it had to be true. But the historical record, painstakingly reconstructed from the accounts of the other surgeons in the car and the white physicians who treated him at Alameint's General, tells a different, more nuanced, but no less damning story. The doctors at the small local hospital did in fact work feverishly to save him. They recognized him immediately, both by his reputation and by his identification. They administered plasma and started a blood transfusion. But his injuries were simply too severe. The main vein in his leg was severed, and he was in profound, irreversible shock. Dr. Charles Drew did not die because he was refused a blood transfusion. He died because his injuries were fatal. While the direct cause of his death is debated by some historians regarding blood availability, the reason the myth took hold, the reason it persists with such power, is because it speaks to a larger, undeniable truth. The myth was not a literal account, but a metaphorical one. It was true because it true. It was true because for thousands of other Black Americans in the Jim Crow South, it true. Dr. Drew died in a society where the systemic racism he had fought his entire life created a healthcare landscape of deadly inequality. Black hospitals were chronically underfunded and under-equipped. Black patients were routinely turned away from better-resourced white hospitals, often dying during the long journey to a facility that would treat them. The very fact that he was being treated at a segregated hospital, in a state where the healthcare system was fundamentally separate and unequal, is the core of the tragedy. His death became a powerful symbol not of a single racist act, but of an entire racist system's lethal potential. His name, once nearly erased by a prejudiced system, now stands as a beacon for scientific excellence and social justice. His techniques for blood storage are the foundation of every modern blood bank, every emergency room, every organ transplant program. The university in Los Angeles that bears his name, the Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, continues his mission of training healthcare professionals to serve underserved communities. The ultimate irony is not that he was refused blood, but that the man who gave the world a gift of universal, life-saving medicine died within a system that insisted on dividing humanity, a system whose lethal consequences are still being fought today. What lessons must we still learn from the profound legacy of Charles Drew? Remembering his story is not just honoring a forgotten hero. It is about recognizing that the fight for justice in science and medicine is and always has been a fight for life itself.